Thank you for joining the Pro Literacy Book Club session, streaming live from the Colvin Center here at Pro Literacy headquarters in Syracuse, New York. Thanks to our live studio audience. We're so happy that you guys made it out, and to our online audience. I'm Laura Pimentel, tonight's moderator. I'm also Director of Development here at Pro Literacy. A few items before we begin. So, like I mentioned, we have both a live online audience as well as our studio audience. For our studio audience, if you all have questions, please hold them to the discussion section and we'll be happy to answer them. For our live online audience, there's a chat screen to the right of your channel, so just feel free to put your questions in at any time. Feel free to discuss between each other. It's open for you to engage with us as you want. The way tonight will go, Camron will do, after introductions, Camron will do an overview for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take the rest of the time until 7:45 to answer questions, get into discussion, and talk about the book. So with that, we're very happy tonight to have Camron Wright, the author of The Rent Collector, our featured book of the month. So happy to have you here, Ramusha.
Pleasure.
Ruth Colvin, our co-founder of Pro Literacy and founder of Literacy Volunteers of America, who I mentioned is almost celebrating 100th birthday, so happy early birthday, Ruth. And Kevin Morgan, President and CEO of Pro Literacy. So with that, Kevin.
Great, thanks Laura. I want to welcome everyone. This is our second series in the Pro Literacy Book Club. And if you don't know, Pro Literacy's mission is to increase adult literacy rates here in the United States and also worldwide. So the book club helps us advocate not only the love of reading, but the importance of a literate society. So very excited about tonight's session and the book, The Rent Collector. And I'm also excited that we're broadcasting live from the Ruth J. Colvin Learning Center. This center at Pro Literacy is really designed to not only facilitate research and studies to help promote and advocate on behalf of adult learners worldwide, but it's also for sessions like this. So I'd like to introduce Ruth Colvin, who is not only one of the founders of Pro Literacy, but she really is the founders of the adult literacy movement here in the United States and abroad. In 1962, Ruth started Literacy Volunteers of America when she learned what the literacy issue was here in Syracuse, New York, but also around the United States and around the world. So she's an author of a number of books, including Tutor 8 and I Speak English. She's really been the mother of the volunteer tutor movement here in this country and around the world. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ruth Colvin. Ruth?
When I first read The Rent Collector, I knew it was for me because it hit me in three ways. I couldn't put it down. The first thing, it was about people who couldn't read. Naturally, that's my passion. The second thing is in a dump. Now, how many people have ever been to a dump? Most dumps are like the size of 29 football fields, huge. Bob and I worked in Guatemala in a dump in 2004. And the third reason was, where was this dump located? In Cambodia. How many people have been to Cambodia? Not many. Bob and I worked 3 months in Cambodia. So I knew this was for me, and I was waiting to do it. It was, the story is set, as those of you that have read it or don't know it, in a garbage dump. Because few of us have worked there, you don't know what it's about. But he describes it and tells you all about it. Camron Wright was born and raised in Salt Lake City, where he still lives with his lovely wife, Allison. And they've raised 4 children. And he has received a master's in writing from Westminster College in Salt Lake City. Now his first book, Letters for Emily. After I read this book, I knew I had to read that. That is just as good, and you must read it too. That is an award winner as well as a selection of the Doubleday Book Club and the Literary Guild, and it's also been published in several foreign languages, which is something. His second book is The Rent Collector, the one we're going to be discussing tonight. This won the Book of the Year Fiction from Forward Reviews, Best Novel of the Year from the Whitney Awards, and was a nominee for the prestigious International Dublin Literary Award. Very well written and a fascinating story. Now his third book that just came out is The Orphan Keeper. It's just released, and I can't wait to read it. The Rent Collector, which we're discussing tonight, was inspired by River of Victory, a documentary filmed by Camron's son, Trevor, in Cambodia. So this is based on true stories. Trevor and his team followed Sang Lee in Stung Meanchey landfill as she searched for ways to heal her child. Fascinating stories, and do welcome Camron Wright.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, it's really an honor to be here with everybody tonight and talk about this book. And let me start with kind of an introduction of really how the book came about and why I chose to write it. My first book, as Ruth mentioned, was Letters for Emily, and it was, gosh, a dozen years ago. And after Letters for Emily, I kicked around a couple of ideas, manuscripts, but really nothing that gelled, and I'm a business guy. And so I became, I was involved in other things, and I really, wasn't out looking for another book. And then, as she mentioned, my second oldest son, Trevor, he did some church service in Cambodia, and then he went back and he worked for a group there called the Cambodian Children's Fund. Just this amazing charity that kind of rescues kids out of the dump and provides a way for them to get an education. And he worked for this charity for a little bit, and then he came back, and in school, at the university, he was a film major. And he and a couple of his buddies who had also been with him in Cambodia decided that they would go back and shoot a documentary on the Cambodian Children's Fund. And so they kind of storyboarded out what they wanted to say, and they borrowed a lot of expensive movie equipment from the university. And then they jumped on a plane and they headed over to Cambodia. Well, in between the time when they kind of made arrangements for this film, and they talked to the guy who started this charity, his name was Scott Nisay. In between the time they talked to him and when they actually, flew back to Cambodia, he had hired a new person kind of in country to help him run this charity. And she wasn't there when these kids worked for the charity. And so she didn't know who they were and kind of what they wanted to do. And so even though they technically had permission to shoot this documentary, she made it really difficult. She started to put up all these roadblocks. And I remember Trevor, he was just so upset. He's like, Dad, what are we going to do? We've got all this movie equipment, and we only have so much time here in Cambodia, and we have no movie to shoot. And so with that kind of disaster looming, they wandered down to the Stung Meanchey dump. And while they were there, they ran into Sang Lee and her family. And she agreed to let these, crazy Americans who speak the language better than she does follow her family around and document what life was like for them living in a garbage dump in Cambodia. And the film they ended up making was, as she mentioned, Ruth mentioned, is called River of Victory. And the name of the dump, Stung Meanchey, translates to River of Victory. It's ironic because there's no river in the dump and it's not a very victorious place. But their film went on to be nominated for the IDA Awards. Now, the IDA Awards are kind of it's the International Documentary Association. It's the Oscars of documentary filmmaking, if you will. They have a student category, and they let 5 student films in every year. The year that theirs was nominated, there were only 2 from the U.S. The other 3 were from other countries around the world. And the first time out of their university that a student film had been nominated, so their professors were ecstatic, and the kids got to go to LA and ride in a limo and walk the red carpet and meet some movie stars, and they thought it was really cool. And it was, but really more important than that, their film has made a difference. Had it not been for their film, I wouldn't have written the book, and a portion of the proceeds go to help the people there in Cambodia and the Cambodian Children's Fund. And it was kind of interesting to stand back and really watch all of this happen as a parent, as not having to be involved. Because really, in standing back and looking at it, had they not had this disaster, they wouldn't have made the film that they ended up making. They would have gone ahead and made a documentary on the Cambodian Children's Fund, and I'm sure it would have been fine, but there had already been other documentaries shot on the organization, so theirs would have been one more on the pile. Instead, with this disaster, they were able to create a film that makes a difference. And I think that's really an important lesson in life. We have these problems come up, and in almost every case, when we look back, they put us in a position to learn something we otherwise wouldn't have learned, to help somebody we otherwise wouldn't have been able to help. And so I think, just a good lesson that I learned kind of in watching it all play out. Well, after they shot all the footage, Trevor came home. He had hours and hours of footage that he had to narrow down to an hour documentary. And so we started to watch some of it. And I remember the first thought that kind of rolled through my head was, Trevor, I'm not going to be much help because I just don't have anything in common with the people there. And then I start to watch the footage. I fall in love with Sang Lee as a character. She's just so amazing, and her determination as a mother to do whatever she needed to do to save her son was just inspiring. And it didn't take very long before I realized, you know what, I have everything in common with the people there. I mean, she wants the same things for her family that I want for mine, that you want for yours. She wants her kids to get an education, her spouse to do well in his job, family to be happy. I mean, kind of these universal goals that really anybody would want anywhere. And there was this moment, this epiphany of, you know what, we're the same. No matter where it's Cambodia or New York or wherever it may be, we're just people. And I thought, you know what, it's time to write another book. And so I took characters from the documentary, real people, real events, and then I wove them into sort of this fictional narrative that I wanted to tell. I kind of took these two stories and wove them together, and of course the result is the rent collector. And that's kind of how it came about, and maybe with that, let's just see what questions you have, and we'll talk about, you know, whatever we want to talk about.
Great. Thanks.
It's lifelong learning. And see,
Absolutely.
this is where you never know when it's going to come. Yours came in a very unusual way.
Yeah.
And about adjustment too. I think, you know, your son having to change from one plan to another and kind of work on the fly and make things work. You know, it's kind of the same with adult literacy. We always are making adjustments, always trying to make things work for the student that we're talking about or the program we're working with. You got to be adaptable, right, Ruth?
You've got to be
You always
adaptable.
talk about being
Always
adaptable.
adaptable, that's right. And there again, it's constantly learning, as I
Yeah.
say. And this is what, as
Exactly.
you know, being 100, I'm still learning. But that's what it is. And I think if we all know that, but if you can't read,
Yeah.
you can't learn so much. So that's why
It's
we're
very
important.
difficult.
I say you authors are important to us because you're giving us books. But our readers are good to you because you
They're
need
very-
readers, we
they're
need
my
books.
heroes.
So we're a good team.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the live audience? Don't be afraid. Well, I would be happy to start off with one. For me, this is what I'm interested in hearing about. So as Kevin mentioned, we started our book club to kind of think about the importance of literacy in our lives. So I know this is could be a very philosophical question for
Sure.
you to answer, but you know, what have you discovered as being a writer? Has it changed anything about the way that you think about literacy and the importance of people being able to read?
Yeah, so I've been intrigued for years, really, about this notion of, in classical literature, we see the same messages repeat over and over again. You know, I'm talking about lessons like don't give up hope, and people deserve second chances, and you know, we see that in stories that date back really hundreds and thousands of years even. It's amazing to me that you can take a piece of literature that was written 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and it's still relevant today. The lessons within those stories still matter. And so really when Sang Lee's story came along, it just seemed like the perfect vehicle to kind of take this notion that I'd been intrigued with and weave those two stories together. Talking about, you know, literacy and the importance of learning. People have asked, well, could Sang Lee read? You know, did she really know how to read? Because I'm taking, you know, real life but blending it with fiction. And really she told Trevor that she couldn't read at first, and then we found out she really can read. She just doesn't read very well. And he said that's really common with the Khmer people. They'll be embarrassed, and so they'll say, well, you know, they can't do something even though they can. But we had one experience that it was really quite amazing. So one of the things that we did early on to try and help the family is we paid Sang Lee a little bit to sign these bookmarks, and we gave those out with some of the first copies of the book. And she already knew how to write her name in English, in Khmer, but we thought, hey, it would be really cool if we could have her write her name in English. And so we taught her how to do that. And it was like teaching, you know, a little kid how to write. And then she would look at we had it written out, so she would look at it, and then she would practice, and she would look again, and then she would practice. And as she was doing this, the neighbors started to gather around, and they were watching her. You know, what's Sang Lee doing? And soon they would start to chime in. They would say, no, pull your Y down, and they would tell her how to do it. And we had a Khmer cameraman who was there filming. Now, as a documentary filmmaker, you're trained to stay behind the camera. You're never supposed to interject yourself into the story. Trevor said that was one of the hardest things in shooting the documentary, was not stepping into the story and helping them. And so he's filming this, and even he starts telling her, no, and he's telling her how to do it. And then when she would get it right, all of the neighbors would clap and cheer. And I'm standing back watching this happen, and she turned around when they were clapping, and she was just beaming. And she was so thrilled and so excited, and I thought, that's the moment that I wrote about. Now, in my story, it's this moment where she realizes she can read Khmer. I'm watching it happen in real life as she's learning to write her name in English, but the emotion was exactly the same. Sang Lee, she loves to read. She's been practicing since we reconnected with her, and she made, and you'll love this, Ruth, she made an interesting comment. She said, now that I'm reading more, I'm not as scared to be at the dump at night. I thought that was amazing because, if it was me, it would be, now that I bought a gun, I'm not as scared to be at the dump at night, right? Or now that I have a baseball bat. But with her, it was reading. It was learning, the practicing reading and feeling more confident in reading gave her more confidence in life, and it made her less afraid. And I think that's such an important lesson, that reading takes away the fear, So, yeah, I'll never forget that.
I don't know if it was intended, but in reading, first of all, I didn't know that Sang Lee wasn't able to read as I was reading the story until it's introduced, which reminded me that a lot of times we meet adults, and unless they told you, you wouldn't know that they couldn't read. So that was really important. And I think the other thing was the student-tutor relationship, which Ruth helped bring about, is really highlighted nicely in the book because they depend on each other.
The relationship develops when you're helping somebody. In fact, you're both learning at the same time. There again, we're teaching students, and that's the important thing. And teaching the student was important, but it changes the tutor as well, because it opens up a new area to you, a new culture, a new person. It's an all-win situation.
Absolutely.
Yes, it is.
Yes, June, we have a question in the audience.
I liked in the book how she asked for help. When she was in a position to ask, can you teach me to read? Because I find a lot of, I'm a literacy tutor, and the student has to step forward and say, I want this. So they get to a certain point where the pain is too high, and they want to step forward, and they want to learn to read, or they want to get their high school equivalency. So I think that's a huge part of it. And I like that she did that. She stepped forward to this powerful person in her life and said, hey, you know how to read. I want to learn to read too. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, I think that's an important lesson. I mean, it takes both. It takes people reaching out, and it takes then the student reaching out as well.
And especially overcoming the perception that she had about soap op, that she was a drunk, and that she, what does she know, or she maybe wasn't as good of a person as she thought that she was, and then to be able to reach out to somebody who you might not have the highest opinion of and ask them for help, that takes a lot of courage, and that's what a lot of our learners are going through, and it's so important for us to be there for them with tutors and programs to be able to help them when they're ready to take that step.
So often we think that if someone can't read or write, that they're dumb. In fact, they've been told that has been growing up in school, you're stupid, you can't learn. But really, you're extra smart if you're able to cope in today's world without that.
Sure.
And they were able to cope to survive without being able to have the skills that we take so for granted.
Very good. Another question in the audience?
Hi, I found that the teacher was just such an amazing character. Was she based on someone real?
Yeah, good question. So, I was taking characters from the documentary. I tried to stay very true to Sang Lee and her husband as far as their personalities and things they would say, and the whole scene with her going back to the province to see the healer. I tried to write that exactly as it happened. As far as the literacy, the literature part, that's again, as I mentioned, sort of this part that I wanted to weave in. But Sang Lee actually in real life had an angry old Cambodian woman that collected her rent. And I was amazed by that, and I was intrigued by that. And that's all I knew about her. I mean, everything I knew about her, that was it. She was an angry old Cambodian woman who came around and collected Sangli's rent. But I used her in the story to sort of tell what happened to the Khmer people during the revolution. And so I did a lot of research. I'm taking real events that happened to real people. I'm weaving them together into this character. And so, you know, it starts to be a fuzzy area, a gray line. You know, is she real or is she not real? You know, but yeah, she was based on an actual character, the rent collector who came around and collected Sangli's rent.
See how it changed her life too,
Yeah.
which
that's
was
right.
amazing.
Yeah.
It was
Yes.
amazing.
Yeah.
Have you been to Cambodia?
I have, yeah. We went back, so they shot the documentary in, it was late 2009. And then just weeks after they came home, the government closed the dump. What happened, it's kind of like the city was here and the dump was here, and as the city grew, it grew around the dump. And so the dump was right in Phnom Penh. And it was actually almost becoming a tourist attraction, if you will. People were going to the dump just to see the people working in the trash, and the government said, you know what, that's not what Cambodia is about. And so they closed the dump just weeks after the kids came home from filming.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they moved the dump, you know, out far away from the city where it was harder to get to. And so by the time they came home and finished the film, and then I wrote the book, it was about 3 years later, and so it was in late 2012. The book was about to come out, and I thought, you know what, we can't have a book coming out on this family who lives in a dump and not have it help them in some way. And so we jumped on a plane, we headed back over to Cambodia to try and find this family. Now, the vast majority, when it was a functioning dump, there were about 600 families who lived around the perimeter of the dump, who made their living going through the trash. And when they closed the dump, the vast majority of those people moved on. And so we were very concerned that we wouldn't be able to find Sangli and her family. They were thankfully one of the few families who had remained there at the site of the old dump, and we were able to reconnect with them. And so yeah, we really spent every day that I was there, we went to the old dump to visit with Sangli and her family, and it was amazing.
It's great that you were able to find her again. Any more questions in the audience? Okay. I'm intrigued by the Cinderella, the working in of the Cinderella story.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear kind of, I thought it was interesting how you referenced different Cinderella stories in different cultures and how was this anything that came up during your visits in Cambodia? How did you work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So that's, again, part of this, I've been intrigued, as I mentioned, for years on these morals in classical literature. Well, the Cinderella story is the perfect example of that. So you can take any culture in any period of time, and they all seem to have their own Cinderella story, and even isolated cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And you scratch your head and think, how is that possible? You know, how is that? And Cambodia actually does that. They have their own Cinderella story. And I looked at I wanted to use that Cinderella story in my book. And there's a professor who had translated that story. And in fact, you can buy it on Amazon. And I wrote to her, and there was a question as to whether I really even needed her permission, because it wasn't her story, but she did translate it. And so just to be on the safe side, I wrote and I said, you know, I'd love to use this Cinderella story in this novel that I'm writing. And I couldn't really get a straight answer. It was really the funniest thing. The first email came back and said, it's always good to get somebody's permission when you want to use their work. I said, okay, that's why I'm writing, you know, and so can I please? And I really never got a straight answer, and I finally determined, you know what, I'm not even going to go there. I'm going to create my own Cinderella story. And so I studied Cinderella stories. I took stories from really around the world, tried to, you know, kind of isolate Asian culture Cinderella stories, but I studied all those, and then I took bits and pieces and I created my own. And it worked out so much better. It was really meant to be that way, because then I could control the pacing and the plot, and it was just able to work and flow so much better than had I sort of forced in the existing Cinderella story. But yeah, they're just intriguing to study, and they're fascinating, and like I say, really cultures all over the world. There's hundreds of them, really.
Yeah,
Cinderella
absolutely.
stories.
It was interesting to see the way you referenced them in the book. I really
Yeah.
appreciated it, because you might be familiar with one, but you know, not
Yeah, you
not all
don't
the different
realize
cultural
that they're
versions.
everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
good.
Any other, you want to make sure? Lost my train of thought. Oh, so it seemed like, as I'm reading the discussion questions for the book club, it seems like you work kind of metaphors and different analogies in pretty seamlessly. Is that pretty easy for you as a writer? Thinking about the clock and, not all things broken deserve to be thrown away. And Lee talking about how that clock,
Right.
deserved a place on her wall and how important it was to her. I'm sure you meant something by that.
Sure.
But how easy is that when you're writing? Are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I was really thinking about it a lot. I mean, it was very important to me, this type of a story, because it was sort of based and weaves in classical literature. I felt like it needed to have layers, and it needed to have a lot of metaphor and meaning written into the story. And I struggle with that. I mean, I had to really work at that. And, an amazing book out there, if we've got writers or readers who are interested, and it's called How to Read Literature Like a Professor. And it sounds boring, right? It sounds horrid, but it's not. It's hysterical. The guy's got such a funny sense of humor. Highly recommended. But yeah, I tried to look at classical literature and how they'd done it, tried to mimic those same techniques in this story. A couple of examples. I've got the essay in there about the old woman and the elephant. Well, elephants are amazingly, they mimic human emotions. And so the elephants will laugh when they're happy, they'll cry when they're sad. If they are walking along a trail and they find elephant bones, they'll pick them up and take them off the trail, and they'll do all of these things that humans would do. And so, again, it's easy to now start and create metaphors with the elephant and with toefl-ibt, so yeah, no, I was I tried to do as much of that as I could, and I didn't connect all of the dots either.
Okay.
I mean, I left a lot of those dots unconnected because it's kind of fun to reread, and as a reader, when you can connect those, you get a deeper connection to the story.
Interpret for yourself too.
Yeah.
Right.
And maybe one of probably the best example of that is really her picking garbage in the dump. Her favorite classical literature was the phoenix rising from the ashes. Well, I described 3 different ways they pick garbage in the dump, and they do that. And there are parts of the dump that will just, the methane gas builds up, spontaneously combust and catch on fire. It'll burn down to ash. Once it does that, then you can see the metal. But if you get in there too quickly, it's hot, you can burn yourself, and so she has scars on her ankles, and she covers those up. And why? Well, the reason is because she was able to gather, her money, enough money to soon become the landowner by working those areas in the dump. So she literally, not only loved the Phoenix story, she became the Phoenix, rising from the ashes of the dump. And so, yeah, you try and write those in there.
Yeah.
I thought the poem that her cousin cited when she was trying to discover what literature was, but that was a really great poem. But was that an existing poem, or did you build that from different parts? The rainbow analogy?
Right. Yeah. There were some in there that, and again, getting back to some of the classical literature, I had to read hundreds of pieces of classical literature, and some worked and some didn't, and it was really just finding those perfect pieces. There were some pieces that I used word for word. There were other pieces I tweaked slightly, and there were some pieces I completely rewrote altogether. And the authors are probably turning over in their graves, but they're dead, and I'm not. It's all in the public domain. So, but that particular poem, I actually created that, wrote that poem to fit into the story. But there's just a lot of different pieces of classical literature that I tried to work in. There is a page on the website if people are interested in that aspect specifically. I've created a page where I kind of listed those pieces that I used and the pieces that I changed, and so at therentcollectorbook.com they can find that there.
I think we have a question in the audience.
Yeah, I had one. The whole story kind of revolves around Nisay being sick, the young daughter. And I thought it was interesting because, when you learn to read, you can read about the medicine and modern medicine and go to the doctor and all that thing. But then she went back to her home village to help cure her daughter. And I thought that was interesting too, because that's more like faith you know, having faith that somebody's gonna help you, you know, cure your child. So I thought that aspect was really interesting too.
Yeah, let me talk about that for a minute, because it was really astounding to watch. So she's got, and again, I tried to write that exactly as it played out. So when they start filming, they realize, oh, her son's really sick. And he's got the little protruding belly. She's taken him to countless Western doctors. These are the doctors that we all go to. They'll go over there and they'll set up a clinic for 2 weeks as kind of a charity. And so she's been to these doctors. They give her vitamins, antibiotics, whatever. As long as he's on the medicine, he seems to be okay. When the medicine runs out, he immediately gets sick again. And so in the middle of filming, she gets into her head that she needs to take him back to the province to see the healer. Well, I love that. I mean, I love now you've got this clash of cultures. You know, you've got the old world ways clashing against the modern ways. And I was so intrigued by that. Well, she indeed goes back to the healer. He's got this broken teacup with a big chip out of it, this black gooey tar that he's mixing in. He's got an array of dirty hypodermic needles, you know, and I know we cringe, right? He picks one and he starts stirring it in. The baby starts to immediately scream. He hasn't even been touched yet, but he knows something's coming and it's not going to be good for me. Well, the healer takes this black gooey tar and he bends the little baby's wrist back and he starts to poke him in his wrists. And he pokes both wrists, he pokes his feet. Of course, the baby's crying horrifically. Then he has Sang Lee take what's left over on her finger and stick in his throat. And so now the little baby's gagging. I'm watching that footage and I was horrified. I mean, if I could reach through the screen and rescue the child, I would. Now here's the irony. Trevor went back 6 months later. The child was fine. He's been fine ever since. So when we were there in late 2012, by then he was about 7, 8 years old. He's so healthy, he's annoying. You know, he was jumping all over us. He was bouncing off the walls, always getting into trouble. I looked at his wrists. He actually still had the little black marks in his wrists. It's like it had tattooed him where the healer had done this treatment. Well, you know, I shake my head and I think, how is that possible? Our doctors couldn't help him. The old healer, the first thing he said when he saw the baby was, oh, I can cure him, and he did. You know, how do you explain that? People ask, well, you know, do you know what it was?
Yes.
What did he give him? And my answer is, I have no idea, but I want to go back and find out because I want to start a pharmaceutical company.
Right.
You know? Yeah.
The
So,
cure-all.
yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah. No, it sounds, that was definitely one of my questions too, is do you know what that black tar was?
Yeah.
Because I think that there's that type of medicine in almost every culture as well. I've definitely, Eastern
Yeah.
Europe, I've heard of
We're
a black tar
starting
substance.
to learn to take some of the old
Right.
medical things and bring them back.
Yeah.
Remember acupuncture? When I was first in China, it was illegal to have it here, and I had acupuncture there. Well, now you can get
Yeah.
acupuncture here.
Yeah.
We're learning. We have to learn from some of the others.
Yeah, and they've been doing it for hundreds, if not thousands of years, so
Right.
we should listen.
Yeah, be
Yeah.
more in touch with your body and what works and what doesn't
Yeah.
work, and again,
And lifelong learning.
it's
isn't
been
it?
lifelong learning. You're always
Right.
expanding, right?
You were talking about the students who wanted it. You know, there again, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. But when they want the water, we've got to be there to help them, and this is what we're trying to do. But you're pointing the way,
Absolutely.
and you've certainly put it in a form that many people will listen to, and thank you.
Well, thank you.
It's been wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think if there's no further questions from the audience, I want to thank everybody for sitting on this panel. Cameron, thank you so much for
Oh,
coming
my pleasure.
all the way out
You
here.
bet.
We really appreciate it. For the book club, our next book will be All the Light We Cannot See. This is by Anthony Doerr, and our next session will be sometime in late January. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for tuning in. We're glad to have you. Happy reading, and please wish Ruth a happy birthday sometime before December 16th. Go to our website, proliteracy.org, to sign her virtual birthday card. Thanks, everybody.
Well, we did it.
You did it.
We did it.
We did it.